about 15 messages so far on Judaism, looking at the diaspora, but only a few thus far on proselytism. And as far as we got about a month ago before we went on vacation was a discussion of the terms, the Old and the New Testament terms, the ger or the gerim and the proselytoi, the proselytos, as well as a look at the question of the effectiveness of Jewish proselytism in missionary activity in the diaspora. Next, tonight, we enter the confusing world of the replete legal details of Jewish proselytism. That's why I thought whenever we did go away on our trip that it was a rather convenient place to take a break. Now, the study is difficult at this point because of anachronistic problems. Now, do you know what I mean by anachronistic problems? Do you know what an anachronism is? We use the word all the time, and I sometimes get in the habit of using words not knowing whether or not all of you understand what I mean. What's an example of an anachronism? No? So someone doesn't know. I'm glad I paused.
Well, like something out of chronology.
Okay, it's a chronological error. The first one that comes to my mind, of course, is the claim by the Mormons that their Bible goes back to the days of the apostles, and yet it contains quotations from the KJV. So that is an anachronistic error. It'd be impossible to predate the KJV and yet contain quotations out of the KJV. There's an anachronistic error, putting things in improper chronology, such as, and we're going to find this with our study tonight, calling a certain people that may have been a distinct entity, let's say in the 1st century A.D., by a name that was not known or popular for those people until the 6th century A.D. And yet we keep calling them by that name, discussing them under the era of the New Testament, the 1st century of the Christian era. Well, you involve yourself in an anachronistic problem right away. But problems like that, as long as they are done knowingly, I don't think are that big of a problem. So it concerns basically the use of certain terms as well as stipulations, when they were in vogue or when they were in effect. Certain stipulations may not have been in effect for Jewish proselytes, let's say in the first 50 years of the Christian era, whereas later, maybe 250 A.D. they are. And yet when we're discussing proselytism by the Jewish people in general, that we may lump all that together and knowingly, I underline, knowingly confuse the time element involved here. And I'll try to point out where these difficulties arise, but I'll also try to simplify matters so that you can comprehend what we're going to be saying and remember it. We saw this about a month ago, that the Jews were both very active as well as very successful in proselytism. They were successful in their proselytizing endeavor both at home. That would basically be the nations that were the immediate neighbors of Israel. We would consider that proselytizing activity at home, as well as abroad. And we would call that the diaspora. There were some reasons why certain people thought they might not be successful, such as the latent anti-Semitism that was present in the world, but we've discussed that about a month ago. Probably one of the reasons for people being so anti the Jew was they were doing something to irritate you. They were accomplishing something. And what irritates one group more than another group? Winning some of your members away. The Jews, that is, winning Gentiles away from paganism over to the true religion of the Jews. True in quotation marks, because the religion of the rabbis was not necessarily the religion of Moses, the lawgiver. Now, in the late ITP period, or to say it another way, during the New Testament era, the rabbis found it necessary to begin to formulate rules for entrance into the Jewish community. Now that to me would be another proof of their success. Why would you need the rabbis to go to the trouble of drawing up some rules for entrance into your community unless you were having some measure of success. So we didn't put that there as a proof, but I think it is another proof that they must have been successful in order for the rabbis to take the time to do this, to see it necessary to take the time to draw up some stipulations for the people. Now, of course, their purpose is to gain some measure of uniformity. We can't, in any organization, any group, including our own, you've got certain types of rules or laws or principles, whatever you want to call them, in hopes of the fact that we'll gain some measure of uniformity. If you don't have uniformity, you probably don't have a group. You just have mass chaos, and you have every person doing that which is right in his own eyes. You have an individualized scene on your hands. But they desired uniformity. And the one way to get uniformity is conformity. Establish some law or precedent to which all potential adherents from among the Gentile people to the Jewish faith would have to adhere. And therefore, if you've got one rallying point and we're all directed toward that, we're going to conform ourselves to that. Since we're all going to one place, we'll end up with uniformity as well. So that's really the background of what we're going to be discussing as we tonight begin looking at different groups of proselytes, as well as I said earlier, the replete legal details drawn up by the rabbis for Jewish proselytism. Now, because of the nature of Judaism and its entrance requirements, evidently the rabbis came to probably chiefly recognize two different groups of proselytes. That will be the heart of our first study tonight. The rabbis probably came to recognize two chief groups of proselytes. But immediately we begin with questions here. Were there more than two groups? Some sources would seem to imply that we have on our hands more than two little easy, neat groups of proselytes, but we have in fact many more. We'll see that later on. We've got the problem of the question, would the rabbis who were establishing laws desiring conformity to that so they would have uniformity among all the proselytes, would they actually recognize lesser and greater forms of proselytism? That would seem to defeat the one thing you are after, which is uniformity. But yet it still seems to be true. That is the fact that the rabbis seem to chiefly probably recognize two groups of proselytes. But I'm just alerting you to some of the problem areas that we have here right away when we make a commitment to this position that they probably recognize two chief groups of proselytes. One being, did they recognize more than that, and the other being, among others, how could they ever gain uniformity, which is what they're after, if they're actually recognizing lesser and greater forms of Jewish proselytism. Now, one scholar has said that the notion of two sorts of proselytes is not found in Christian writings until the 14th century A.D. But the notion of two sorts of proselytes, or two groups of proselytes, this notion was not found in Christian writings until the 14th century A.D. And therefore it would, he argues, undoubtedly be best to speak of only one group of proselytes and the others as those who came near. Now here we're coming across one of our first anachronistic problems. I don't know how many of you are familiar with any studies in Jewish proselytism, but one of the first things you hear are the two groups of proselytes. There's the proselytes of such and such, which I'll give you here in a moment, and the proselytes of such and such. I mean, two different groups. And yet, and I think this particular writer is correct here, that the notion of two groups of proselytes not being found in Christian writings for 14 centuries after the time when we were supposed to be seeing it experienced here, and not found in Jewish writings until much later, is probably not really true. In other words, it's probably convenient to speak of the two groups of proselytes during the days of Jesus and the apostles. But in fact, there was only one group of proselytes and another that we would describe as those who came near. Now, do you have any questions thus far? I would call all of that introduction to what we're going to be discussing in really both of the lectures tonight. Okay.
Was there any other writings that had evidence of these two proselyte groups?
Earlier than 14th century A.D. Christian writings, yes. Most of the Jewish writings have evidence of, let's say, various divisions among these Gentile adherents to Judaism, but they don't speak of them as two groups, as though we think of like the Moravians and the Mormons or something. You know, we think of two different groups, two entirely distinct different groups. Really not. All we have is one group, and that's the group spoken of as a group, as something that was an officially, legally recognized group among the Jews, therefore in Jewish writing, and by transference in Christian writing, especially in later centuries. The others would simply be those who came near. And we're going to go on in more detail now to explain that. So let's look at classifications then. Classifications. We'll have a number 1, a number 2, and a number 3 then tonight under this. Classifications. Number 1. The full proselyte. Now, here's our problem, going back to what we just discussed before. Either you're a proselyte or you're not a proselyte. So how could you be full? If you're full, that implies a lesser form of proselytism, which is the whole problem of trying to divide this up into two different groups. But it's really just a convenient way to speak of different divisions that were recognized but that were not necessarily accepted. So our full proselytes, number 1. The one distinguishing mark of this group of people was circumcision. The full proselytes accepted this, circumcision. Again, we're just kind of conveniently using a name, full, and I'll give you even a better name to actually remember them by here in a moment. We recognize the anachronistic difficulties, but we're knowingly practicing simplification here. Now, they went by different names in the Jewish writings. Full proselyte is just my own name, to show you that there were some that were full and some that were not full. But we will actually get into a few different names that the Jewish writers and writings gave for them. First of all, and this was their most basic name, and this is what I would like you to remember them by, was the proselyte of righteousness, the so-called Ger Tzedek. The proselyte of righteousness. This was the normal name that was most commonly found in the basic early Jewish writings. The proselyte, in other words, they didn't call them full proselytes. That's just what I put up there so I can have a 1 and a 2 in my A's and B's. But they wouldn't call him a full proselyte. They would refer to this man or this woman as a proselyte of righteousness, a Ger Tzedek. A second name that's found in the Jewish writings would be the proselyte of the covenant, the Ger HaBerith. Proselyte of the covenant. It's not so clear what, if anything, the Jewish writers actually meant by giving different names for this group. These names are, the first two anyway, are not necessarily chronologically stated, so that, let's say, for the first 125 years they call them the Ger Tzedek, and then for the next 125 years they went to our second choice, the proselyte of the covenant. These are found during the same time, and it's not so clear what the difference is, if any difference at all actually exists, between using of righteousness or of the covenant. And then thirdly, we just got various other names. Those were the two prominent ones, with number one being the chief one, but they would refer to them by such titles as the proselyte of the camp. That's interesting. That probably really should fit down with our second case that we'll get to here in a moment. Or the proselyte of Israel. So the proselyte of the camp or of Israel would be some other choices. So forth. The rabbis generally hold to Ger Sedek. The Mishnah simply has Ger, which is interesting. The Mishnah doesn't seem to really make a distinction between different kinds. Simply Ger, or the Gerim, the sojourners. Now there are fewer technical questions about these proselytes because the Ger Sedek were the full ones, the complete ones. They went through the full ceremonial process to be adopted into Judaism. Thus, they had full privileges afterward, including worship and sacrifice at the temple. Now, we're going to later see a change in rabbinical attitude, even toward this group of proselytes. We would think, since these are referred to as, by my name, the full proselytes, that the rabbis would be more in favor and more inclined to this group, because they went all the way into Judaism. And therefore, if there's going to be any lessening or whatever of love between the rabbis and the proselytes, it would be the second group and not the first. But we see a complex series of events which occur, and then it's going to alter the whole way the rabbis think about those whom their early forefathers had actually gone out to convert to Judaism. And we'll also look at the legal status with regard to actual details in life, what they were required to do and what they simply were not allowed to do later on. In the Old Testament, people like Rahab and Ruth would logically fit right here. Full proselytes. They go through the full ceremonial process. Now, of course, the laws of proselytism were definitely not nearly as complex in the Old Testament era as we find with the rabbis in the New Testament dispensation. Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, he was Uriah the what? The Hittite. Well, how in the world is he a Hittite, yet one of David's chief and chosen men? Well, he must have been a proselyte. And you'll find a whole lot of names. Of course, Rahab and Ruth are the two most famous. Maybe Uriah would rank third behind them. But there are a lot of names where the man or the woman is given along with their earlier nationality. And Uriah is so well known that we kind of know him. A lot of you knew right away. Uriah the Hittite. We kind of think of him as Mr. Hittite. His first name was Uriah and his last name was Hittite. And because we know them that way so well, we fail to think, wait a minute, he wasn't a Jew. Wait a minute, he didn't descend from Abraham. He was a Hittite. If you read carefully, which is hard to do because you're always trying to catch everything that's there, but if you read carefully, you'll find a lot of names where the man's name is given and then his nationality after that, which will alert you to the fact we're talking about a proselyte here, a full proselyte. To use the rabbinical designation years, centuries later, a Ger Sedek, a proselyte of righteousness. And then in the second place, we have, of course, the half one. We have the full ones and we have the half proselyte. Here is where the problems begin in technical matters. And you'll find a lot of people arguing, or you'll find some people arguing, that there was no such thing as a half proselyte. Okay, we could grant that as long as we are using proselyte in such a strict term that in using it we can only refer to someone who's gone all the way. Then if proselyte means a convert to Judaism, then you can't have a half convert. I mean, by definition, the words wouldn't fit together. If we're using proselyte as it's used many centuries later in Christian writings, kind of loosely, we're talking about Gentile people who, to a greater or lesser degree, were drawn to Judaism, then I think we can speak of a half proselyte. Again, anachronistic, but we're trying to simplify matters so it's not that confusing. And let's again, like we did with the full proselyte, look at some different names. I'll give you the chief one that I would like you to remember them by, the proselyte of the gate, the Ger HaSha'ar. You don't have to remember the Hebrew names. I'm not even writing them in Hebrew. Just transliterating it. The Ger HaSha'ar. Of righteousness and of the gate are the two different proselytes, not full and half. This is how you will see them in most of the writings. A proselyte of the gate, the Ger HaSha'ar. Speaking of first century people by that title is, as Lightfoot said many years ago, using a convenient anachronism. But they're found in later Jewish writings under that designation as proselyte of the gate. And that's how most people find it easiest to remember them. Proselyte of righteousness, proselyte of the gate. The phrase of the gate, of course, is much later origin. But you do have a biblical precedent, if you'll notice in passages such as Exodus chapter 20 and verse 10, you actually do find in the Old Testament narrative the juxtaposition of this term gate with these alien people. Exodus 20 and verse 10. And perhaps the Old Testament is the origin for the post-New Testament era development of the phrase proselyte of the gate, Ger HaSha'ar. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. We're back to a stranger term, a sojourner, a ger term, which is within thy gates. You'll find this in Deuteronomy 5:14, the same context, giving of the Ten Commandments, and Deuteronomy 14:21, a verse we've looked at earlier. You will, in the second place, see them referred to as half-Jews. Really, there's no such thing as a half-Jew. This is what you'll find in Josephus' writings. He doesn't use these rabbinical things as the Ger Sedek and the Ger HaSha'ar, proselyte of righteousness and proselyte of the gate, because Josephus is living during the 1st century A.D. And these terms are of much later origin. They come much later in Jewish history. But they're always kind of lifted out and anachronistically superimposed back on the 1st century A.D., so we'll have some measure of uniformity by which we can discuss the matter. But how could you be a half-Jew? Sometimes we speak of the Samaritans as half-Jews. Well, that's just a popular designation. You can't be half something else. You just couldn't be that. You've got to either be a Jew or not a Jew. I mean, fully in, you could have Jewish blood in you, that still doesn't make you half Jew. You've got to be fully in line with all that the people that we know as the Jews stand for. And the Samaritans had their own private temple on Gerizim that John Hyrcanus destroyed, finally, remember. So they were not in total agreement with the Jewish people, so they weren't Jewish. They weren't Jews. Thirdly, they were referred to simply as settlers, as the Ger Toshav. T-O-S-H-A-V. Now this was almost the original meaning of simply the term ger in the Old Testament, a resident alien, a settler. So that'd be a good word by which we could describe them. Now at this juncture, so we're still down here with number 2, that's the race number 1. I'll try to leave righteousness so that stays in your mind. At this juncture, we have the very important question of any relationship between this group, the proselytes of the gate, the proselyte of the gate, and the so-called God-fearers of the book of Acts. They're referred to there as the Sebomenoi. Sedomenoi, and the Phalbumenoi. And that would be Phoboumενoi. Assuming that those two words are referring to the same group of people in the book of Acts, those are the two terms that appear. The Sebomenoi, to give you the whole phrase, ton theon, the fearers of God, or the fearers of heaven. And the Hebrews had their own phrase for that, the Yireh Shamayim. I'll just give it to you in English. The fears of heaven. Heaven being you've seen this word recently, heaven being a circumlocution for God, oftentimes in the rabbis, and it's found in Matthew's gospel with the kingdom of heaven, whereas in Mark's you find the kingdom of God, and Luke's you find the kingdom of God, and so forth. So it's a convenient circumlocution due to the superstition of the Jewish people. I think we came across that term recently in guidelines for the KJV. Now this is an explosive question that's going to solve a lot of different and interesting matters that I'm sure you're not even aware of. We'll make you aware of them and then solve them in the book of Acts. These various people that are always popping up there. Well, I hate to even give you a passage. Well, I've given you one before. I hate to even give you one because then you'll be over there looking around, and maybe we better just save that. But maybe you're familiar with some, and you can find your own. But the Sebomenoi and the Phalbumenoi, ton theon, the fears of God or the fears of heaven, the Yireh Shamayim, as the Hebrews or the Jews refer to them by. That's an important question that we're going to come to later. A question that really it concerns itself in many people's minds with both of these, numbers 1 and 2. The proselytes of righteousness as well as the proselytes of the gate. Although I think more properly most people would discuss it down here under number 2, the proselytes of the gate. So all of those technical matters aside, and for the future, let's come back to the proselyte of the gate. Now, who was he? What was he? We know the full proselyte. He went all the way, the distinguishing mark being circumcision. Well, if that was the one distinguishing mark of the full proselyte, its absence would be the one distinguishing mark for the half-proselyte. He was not circumcised. The half-proselyte was a Jew who came into contact with Judaism. He liked what he saw in Judaism. He liked its high spiritual teachings, its high ethical and moral principles. But he was not willing to take the final step of circumcision. And circumcision was always the ID as far as the Jews were concerned. That was identification. To be circumcised was to be a full participant in all of the riches of the blessings of Abraham. And the only way that a Gentile could experience that was to go the way the Jew did, and that was by circumcision. Birth for the Jew, being a Jew, was great. It was one thing. But to be born a Jew, which was, of course, impossible, and never to be circumcised, well, of course, you'd be damned. Because if you don't have the sign of the covenant, and this is according to the book of Genesis, that was the sign of the covenant, was, I want you to be circumcised, every male child, the 8th day after birth, circumcised in his flesh. If you don't have the sign of the covenant, then what does that say? You don't have the covenant. You'll have to have its external sign in order to prove that you are a participant in Abraham's blessings. Now, you'll recall all of Paul's problems with this in the New Testament. This question of circumcision, not concerning Jews so much, but concerning Gentiles. The Judaizers, we have over here in Acts 15, the council at Jerusalem, certain men which came down from Judea and taught the brethren, except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved. In other words, you would be damned without circumcision. That's the way that you inherit all the blessings of Abraham. They knew that there was something eschatological and something far-reaching in those promises found in the first 3 verses of Genesis 12. Remember when God said, if you'll do these things, you'll follow me and you'll come to this land, then I'll bless you, make your seed great, I'll make your name great. Whoever blesses you, I'll bless. Whoever curses you, I'll curse. And in you will all the world be blessed. Well, if we're going to be blessed in Abraham, we're going to have to do whatever Abraham had to do to get blessed. And they argued it was his circumcision. But then Paul comes and argues and said, but he had faith, Romans 4, before he was circumcised. His faith is seen in Genesis 15:6, and he's circumcised in Genesis 17. So chronology is not just something of no importance at all. Paul is arguing on that basis, that Abraham's faith came prior to his circumcision. And what do we read in Genesis 15:6? But that he had faith, he believed God, and he was justified. It was imputed unto him for righteousness. So Paul was basing a lot of his argument on the chronological order of the 15th and 17th chapter of the book of Genesis. So Paul is running into this problem, and that's one of the intersections of our study now and a study of the New Testament. If you're going to study the New Testament, the book of Acts, Galatians, Romans, Colossians, and there are a few other epistles, but those Romans, Colossians, and there are a few other epistles, but those are the chief 3, then you're going to have to know something about this explosive question during the time. And I guess every Christian knows a little bit about it. That basically can be summed up in the following, that the Judaizers required circumcision, and Paul said that we are circumcised spiritually in our heart by faith in Christ. And whenever that happens to us, then we automatically are the recipients of the blessings of Abraham. But the question is much more complex than that, because it's more than just a spiritual question. It's a legal question as far as the Jews are concerned. And I think it's a legal question as far as the Apostle Paul is concerned. Remember, he on one occasion has a young man, Timothy by name, in Acts 16, first 5 verses, circumcised. Then whenever it comes to Titus in Galatians 2, he says no. And so some would charge Paul with fickleness or equivocation there. He's going between two opposites, saying at one time it's okay to circumcise, and another he forbids it. Well, we've discussed that before as well. There are principles involved in that. We've got to go on more than just the bare letter that we have. So anyway, these proselytes of the gate are not willing to take this final step of circumcision. They're unwilling due to perhaps one or more reasons. The physical pain involved. If you are a male born in the United States, let's say, anywhere from 20 beyond years ago, you're probably circumcised. You find, we'll get into this, I don't know where that fits in, maybe ethics somewhere. You get into all of the debates about circumcision that's so widespread now in the Western world. It's rather recent. And you hear all of these gross stories about circumcision versus non-circumcision and all of this. But anyway, I was going to say you'll find a large number of people in America who've been born in recent times who are not circumcised. They've come to various conclusions based on what various doctors and other people have advised their parents, I would assume. And I guess I said all that to say that most people aren't circumcised when they're 26 years old. You're circumcised when you're like 2 days or 8 days or 2 weeks old. So there is pain involved. And those of you who are circumcised males, whenever you were a child, of course, you don't remember the pain. And how would you like to be a male and have to go through, it's just a cutting off of your flesh. You just take they used old sharp stones, remember in the Old Testament days, and just kind of whack away. And that hurts, and that's bloody, and it's painful. So that might be one reason you could argue, the potential convert to Judaism could argue, well, I agree with all of your spiritual teaching, so I've gone far enough. And where he holds something in reserve is I don't want to go through the physical pain. I think probably more likely the reason they didn't go through with it all the way was that it was a stigma socially to be attached to the Jews. In other words, kind of, you could be a silent witness for Judaism. In other words, you could be a closet convert. You accept all the beliefs and you worship God in your heart, but you're not going to go to the temple or to a synagogue or something because, you're in the fish industry, and if your Gentile neighbors find you at the temple or the synagogue, they're going to cut you off from fellowship, and you're going to lose your livelihood and your income. Because I think that if we have true moral, spiritual, eternal convictions in our heart, then we'll go through whatever physical pain is necessary, to reach that conclusion. I mean, a little physical pain, it'll be over with in a few days. I mean, you see this account of that back in the book of Genesis, whenever this whole tribe of Shechem's people, they were circumcised, they came in and slaughtered the Jews. The patriarch slaughtered the people because they were sore. It was painful to them. But a few days later, everything would have been okay. So I would probably trace it back to something more basic, something deeper than a desire to avoid physical pain. And that would be a desire to avoid social pain, being counted as an outcast. However, they were required to accept certain things. It was not required of them to be circumcised. But the following things were required of this second group, the proselytes of the gate, the Ger HaShamar. First of all, monotheism. That's rather obvious. Now this is for rabbinical writings. How far we can superimpose this back into New Testament era is another question, but monotheism, a belief in one God, a belief in and a worship of one God. Secondly, and I would start this with perhaps. This seems to be questionable, and I don't have a conclusion on it. Perhaps Sabbath observance. I haven't seen anywhere where I've been able to nail that one down one way or the other. I would say perhaps Sabbath observance. Definitely monotheism. You couldn't be a convert to the Jewish faith and worship Apollo or Zeus or something. And thirdly, the so-called Noachian laws. The so-called Noachian laws. Three things: monotheism, the Noachian laws, definitely, and perhaps Sabbath observance. They did not have to follow through with circumcision, baptism, sacrifice, that's an interesting one, or adopt the kosher method of food preparation and consumption. Do you know what kosher is? Well, as soon as you say yes, I'll say no, you don't either. None of us do. We know what basically the word means, but it would take a doctor's degree in Judaism to know how to make kosher food. You come across it in the grocery store every now and then. This is kosher. And we probably raised in America, and America's its elite echelon is controlled by a lot of Jewish people. So you find a lot of kosher food, and there are kosher restaurants, and there are kosher meat packing companies, and there's kosher everything. But it'd be better to know Leviticus than to know the kosher laws of the Jewish people. But it's a certain method of food preparation and consumption. And Orthodox Jews will still follow that today. And unorthodox Jews won't follow that. They could care less about the food as long as it tastes okay. So they do not have to follow through with circumcision, baptism, sacrifice, or the kosher method of food preparation and consumption. Now you're probably curious about these Noachian laws. What are these so-called Noachian laws? Well, let's go back and look at that. We know what monotheism is. We know what Sabbath observance and all these other things are. What are the Noachian laws? Well, let's divide the Noachian laws. What can we get rid of here? Well, I'll give you an A and a B for the Noachian laws. A. 6 Noachian laws. They're called Noachian, but they were first given to Adam, according to the Jewish rabbis, first given to Adam and then carried on by the patriarch Noah, hence the name Noachian. And these are the following. They had to abide by these. Now, remember, not circumcision, baptism, sacrifice, kosher food. Not those. Monotheism, perhaps Sabbath observance, and the Noachian laws. What are those? They are these. Number 1, no idol worship. Number 2, no blasphemy. Number 3, no murder. Number 4, no fornication. Number 5, no theft. Number 6, help establish and participate in courts of Jewish justice. Establish courts of justice. Civil justice. So you've got a 1 through 6 there. No idol worship, no blasphemy, no murder, fornication, theft, and establish and abide by the civil laws of the Jewish court system. Now, let me say something else about this number 6. It's found in different wording in different Jewish writings. It may refer to them simply being bound by Jewish decrees and not having to help establish any courts of justice. That's questionable, whether they have to establish or simply abide by the laws that are passed down. Notice that I say these under A, these 6, from no idol worship to the establishment of courts of justice, the rabbis inform us, were first given to Adam and then carried on by Noah. Well, of course, we don't have any biblical record of, such things like, fornication, probably all of these, specifically given back in those early chapters of Genesis to Adam. One that is specifically a post-diluvian happens to be the latter of these, number 6, the establishment of courts of justice. So here it would not be anachronistic of us in our interpretation of the rabbis, but anachronistic of them in their interpretation of Genesis, to count this 6th one, the establishment of courts of justice, as something originally given to Adam. For indeed, it really fits in Genesis 9 and verse 6. That's where we should place it, which is in the context of the God-ordained establishment of human government. Prior to this, you don't really have anything in the Bible about human government. And I think Martin Luther is the one in his commentaries, and others have followed suit, who has made a big deal about Genesis 9:6 and the establishment of human government, because Luther was the one, remember, who believed in 2 kingdoms, that every Christian is a part of 2 kingdoms. You're part of the spiritual kingdom of Christ above, but you're also part of an earthly kingdom here below. And we shouldn't revolt against that earthly kingdom below because it has its origin above. Paul gives us more on that in Romans 13. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, then by man shall this first man's blood be shed. All right, that seems to give man a certain right of jurisdiction over other men. And so, although it's kind of cryptic and hidden here in one small verse, just the first part of it, just really Genesis 9:6a, a reference to human government, I agree that this actually is where the foundation for human government is actually found. So the establishment, number 6, of courts of justice was not given to Adam. This is specifically given to Noah after the flood. And concerning all this business of idol worship and blasphemy, I mean, we are not the ones to say, and I guess no one else is, what God told Adam back there in the garden that's not recorded in Genesis here. You'd have to have some extra biblical revelation of what went on back there. Did he go down a list of these things? I don't know. I don't know when these were given to mankind. But it's safe to say that mankind knew that these things were forbidden him. But when it comes to courts of justice, that's another matter. I think that's after the flood. That's something that's not Adamic, but Noachian for sure. And then under B, still giving it to you the way the rabbis gave it to us, there would be one post-diluvian law. Of course, we would count 6 under A as post-diluvian, but one post-diluvian law, according to the rabbis, that was given to Noah. And they're right here. And that concerns the eating of blood, a prohibition against the flesh of a dead animal with blood remaining in it. This is Genesis 9:4. But flesh with the life thereof, and what's the life? Is the animal still alive? No, he defines it, which is the blood thereof, ye shall not eat. And so, of course, one of probably the chief component in the Jewish kosher method of food preparation is the draining of blood from the animal. Of course, most meat, I guess, is drained of blood, but not all of it, though. So really, we would put number 6 under A down here with B. This is something post-diluvian. Human government as well as a prohibition against blood, or not something given to Adam back here in the garden. Remember, Adam couldn't even eat meat. All that was given to Adam was vegetables and fruits and nuts and herbs and spices and the likes. It was a vegetarian diet. Okay, let's go on. We're still under this second group. We're almost through with this first discussion tonight. Noachian, the rabbis taught that these laws are binding on all men because these were given prior to the Jewish people, prior to Abraham. And so anything given prior to Abraham is not something that's just required, of the Jewish people. It's required of everyone. So the rabbis taught these laws are binding on all men, not just the Jews, but of course most men chose not to abide by these laws. But the proselyte of the gate, to call him by the best known phrase, though it's a late one, was not counted by the Jews, by the rabbis, as either an heathen or a Jew. Now, generally, we only have 2 groups of people. You're a Jew or not one. Well, they didn't count him as a heathen. Neither did they count him as a Jew. Legally, he was still counted as a full Gentile. However, he could participate in the synagogue service, and he was allowed to mix with Jewish believers. So, legally, they count him as a full Gentile. But we really couldn't say they count him as an heathen because he's allowed to mix in their synagogue service with the Jews. But then we couldn't say they counted him as a Jew because legally he's a full Gentile. Later on in rabbinic development of thought, the rabbis taught that if after 12 months of observing Noachian laws, you're a half proselyte, a proselyte of the gate, you do not go ahead and then develop into a full proselyte, a proselyte of righteousness, that all of your works are null and void, and you are simply counted as a goy again, a pagan, a heathen. See, there were steps. We're going to be getting into that in the next lecture tonight. There were steps through which they had to go. And so, you go through these steps of accepting monotheism, perhaps observing the Sabbath, abiding by these Noachian laws. But later in rabbinic development, they're not going to allow you just to be a so-called fence sitter for the rest of your life. In other words, you have a period of 12 months during which you are to decide whether or not you're going all the way. A period of probation, we could call it, of 12 months, whether or not you're going all the way. And if you don't follow through with what? The basic thing, circumcision. You follow through with that, you're a Jew. If you don't follow through with circumcision, you are simply counted among the goyim again, the nations, the heathen, the pagans. So, these were the 2 groups. again anachronistically, but these were the two groups: the full proselytes, the half proselytes, the proselytes of righteousness, the proselytes of the gate. If we want to be real technical, proselyte means a convert. So if you're a proselyte of the gate, you're not a convert. To be real technical, there's only one group of proselytes, those who are proselytes, who allow themselves to be fully proselytized. But we'll stay with the two groups because it's convenient. However, in conclusion tonight, let me give you the fact that the rabbis did invent many other fanciful distinctions for yet more groups separate from these first two groups. Of course, we're going to give you what the rabbis are saying, but we're talking about centuries or scores of years later. I have a 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, however you're numbering right here. And of course, sometimes one of these distinctions, because let's say the first one has to do with motives, then it might have to do with one who's half or full, because he doesn't actually, with his motives, fit the qualifications for being a proselyte of righteousness or of the gate. What I mean by that is, number one, false proselytes. These were people, Gentiles, who joined Israel out of impure or worldly motives. You see, I told you how detailed and legal all of this would be. That's just beyond what the average Christian would know, because you've got to do some Jewish study for this. He joined Israel out of a worldly motive. Let me give you 3 examples of this. We're under false proselytes, the ones with an impure motive. I'll give you 3 different cases. First of all, there was the so-called love proselyte. He was the one who became a proselyte so he could marry a Jewish girl. Well, the rabbis were smart enough to reason that's a wrong reason for committing yourself to Judaism. You're not really committed. You found a good-looking Jewish girl, and that's why you're coming to the synagogue now. And so we could call these love proselytes many times that get in the church. You know, they find someone that they like that's in the church, and so they promise them, well, I'll go to church with you. And they go long enough to marry them, and then they drop out. Of course, that really couldn't happen in Jewish circles because the families were much more knit together than they are today. And that Jewish girl simply couldn't drop out. So she's going to stay, so he's going to stay for, well, supposedly the rest of his life. But the rabbis thought, no, that's a no-no because your motive is not right. A second example of a false proselyte. In other words, this might have been a man who went all the way through circumcision, but he's really not a proselyte of righteousness. If anything, he's not of righteousness because he's practiced duplicity on these people. He's lied to them with his motives. Secondly, the man for woman. Man-for-woman, as well as the reverse of this, the woman for man proselyte. These are those who simply followed their spouse in Jewish proselytism. And that's different than the first one. The first one, we've got a Jewish girl. She's already a Jew. The Gentile meets her and wants to convert so he can marry her. And so he converts with a wrong motive. Here we've got 2 Gentiles, and the man likes Judaism, and so he converts. And so the woman, for whatever reason, such as to keep harmony in the home, converts along with him. He's a true convert. She's a false convert. She's a woman for man proselyte. If it's the other way around, she converts and he follows her, he is a man for woman proselyte. And then thirdly, and I don't know of a specific name that these went by, but those who converted for the benefit they would receive from the relief fund for poor people. The Jews would not just give relief money to poor pagan Gentiles. The sooner the world was rid of them, the better. Then all the kingdom of Moses and Abraham and David could be established. And so there were some Gentiles, evidently, who were smart enough to realize this, so they were poor, so they would convert to Judaism to get a hand in the relief bag of the Jewish people. The rabbis recognize this and pronounce that not legal, not fair. So those are three cases of the false proselytes. Number two, we have the lion proselytes. Lion, the animal, lion proselytes. They're named after those in 2 Kings 17, verses 25 and following. And these are people who follow God out of fear. Let me just read. We've got a few moments left here. 2 Kings 17:25. And so it was at the beginning of their dwelling there. Now this is after the fall of the northern kingdom, Israel. And the Assyrians import a lot of foreigners into the northern kingdom. That these foreigners imported into the north, Gentiles, feared not the Lord, therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which slew some of them. And then you go on and read the account. What they desire is a priest who will come and inform them about this, the God of this new land into which they've been brought, and they're going to try to follow him so they won't die by lions. So I guess they could be called the fearful proselytes as well. But they were nicknamed the lion proselytes, but the reason was they converted out of fear. And let me give you two examples here. One would be the Samaritans. And of course some people believe that here is the origin of the Samaritan people, 2 Kings 17. Another interesting example would be those known as the Esther proselytes. We're under 2b here, or A2, however you're numbering it. The Esther proselytes. According to the book of Esther, chapter 8 and verse 17, we read, "In every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them." The theme is the same, and that is fear. So we've got the lion proselytes, the Samaritans, and those during the days of Mordecai and Esther. The second group referred to as the Esther proselytes. Then number three, we have the dream proselytes. Dream proselytes. Those who converted as the result of some dream they had at night. Now, a hypothetical case of this, something that's somewhat similar, which we just read this afternoon in our prayer time together in my study, would be Pilate's wife. What did she say to Pilate? "But have nothing to do with this just man, because I have suffered many things this day in a dream concerning him." Some people think, now there we've got a case of this dream proselyte. That's debatable. It's not it wouldn't be a convert to Judaism, but to Christianity anyway. But people who were influenced by dreams, a Gentile who had a dream, mysterious, people are having dreams all the time. And I guess there are probably valid occasions where a dream has brought someone to a saving knowledge of Christ, because God supernaturally revealed something to them in a dream, and they were afraid or interested, or it just shook them so much they converted to Christianity. And evidently there were some that converted to Judaism under the influence of a dream. And then fourthly, we have the press-in proselyte. The press-in proselyte. And the rabbis use as a case example here the Gibeonites in Joshua 9. Do you remember the account there? Okay, so here we've got a group of people who, again, I guess it's due to fear, but they will do anything, whatever requires, trickery, anything. They'll do whatever they can to press in to your group so that they can be a part of your group. If you're not familiar with Gibeonite accounts, you can read Joshua 9. But they use trickery, anything they could use, to deceive Joshua into thinking that they were, people from a far country so they could be allies, friends with the Jewish people. Now, from the false proselytes to the lion to the dream, right down to the press proselytes, you don't have to remember any of that. That's later Jewish fanciful notions that doesn't really have any role in New Testament, Book of Acts, Pauline epistle studies, and so forth. The two things to remember are the first two, the proselytes of righteousness and the proselytes of the gate.